So I made a video yesterday talking about how the conspiracy theory that I believe in is that Jesus never actually existed.
All right, let's see it.
And a lot of people responded to that and they wanted to know a little bit more. They wanted to know why I don't think Jesus existed. So I thought tonight I would make a short video detailing the primary reason why. According to the Gospels, Jesus was extremely famous. He was known throughout the land. People would flock from miles around to hear him preach or even get healed. He brought at least one person back from the dead. So, keeping all that in mind, how come nobody ever wrote down anything about him until years and years and years after he was dead?
So, this is a wonderful question, and there are a handful of things to consider. The first thing to consider is the way that Jesus is represented in the Gospels doesn't necessarily reflect the life or the achievements of the actual historical Jesus. Because what the overwhelming majority of scholars agree on is that the best way to account for how the data got to be the way they are in terms of the different accounts across the text of the New Testament, the traditions that were in circulation, the following that grew following the death of Jesus, the best way to account for all that is by positing a historical figure who lived and died, and to whose biography and life all these other details accreted. So the overwhelming majority of scholars, virtually all scholars of relevant disciplines, agree there would have been a historical Jesus. And so what we read in the Gospels doesn't necessarily reflect what that historical Jesus actually did. So when we talk about having throngs and throngs of people following him and him raising people from the dead, those are almost certainly part of the posthumous accretions to the tradition. Certainly the historical Jesus that is reconstructed by scholars had some kind of following, but it wasn't a following that would have captured the attention of the Roman Empire unless and until he goes and does something like starts a riot in the temple during the Passover. And then the local authorities say, well, he's got to be put to death. So the first thing to note is we've got to separate the historical Jesus from the Jesus of the Gospels. And we cannot take the Gospels' representation of the life and the achievements and the events of Jesus as representative of the historical figure that we're trying to reconstruct or we're trying to find in the historical record. Next thing to note is the type of movement Jesus led. This was an apocalyptic movement. Jesus thought that the end of the world was going to happen immediately. So within the following, you have no reason to write anything down for posterity because everything is coming to an end anyway. Now that kind of archivist mindset or intuition or instinct is natural for a lot of people today, but that's also because literacy is far higher today than it was in the ancient world, and recording things for posterity and for all kinds of other reasons is far more widespread and common than it was in the ancient world. So we would have no reason to expect any of Jesus's followers, probably very few of whom would have been literate to begin with, to see a need to write anything down because it's all coming to an end anyway. Also, that time and that place is notorious for a lack of written sources. The overwhelming majority of our reconstructed history of first century CE, Judea and Galilee, comes from one or two historical sources. Folks like Josephus, folks like Philo are responsible for the overwhelming majority of what we think we know happened in the first century CE in Judea, in Galilee. We don't really have much else. Now, we have a lot of material remains that we can correlate to these texts to try to see what can be corroborated, what can't. And so we can reconstruct a lot of the gaps that are left in the historical record, and we can even falsify some of the things that are in the historical record. But this time and this place is not well known for writing things down. In fact, we didn't even have any direct material evidence for the existence of Pontius Pilate, the Roman who ruled in Judea during the time that Jesus was supposed to have had his ministry and been put to death, until we discovered a single inscription in the 1960s that mentions his name. So we don't have written records for pretty much every single person who lived in first century CE Judea and Galilee. And there were people who were a lot more famous than Jesus was during his life. Jesus became overwhelmingly most famous after his death, when traditions about his resurrection began to spread. So this is not really a compelling case to make against the historicity of a Jesus. Mostly this case just reveals that a lot of folks don't understand historiography, don't understand the accident of preservation, and don't understand the history of this time and place.
Our earliest accounts of Jesus come from Paul.
So I don't think this is, strictly speaking, accurate. Our earliest accounts of Jesus come from the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, and then the Gospel of Luke. Our earliest references to Jesus come from Paul, but Paul doesn't really give any accounts of the historical Jesus, apart from a couple of oblique references to him being born of a woman, which is how most of us are born.
Paul famously never met Jesus in real life. He had a hallucination about him while he was on the road to Damascus, which resulted in his conversion to Christianity. But interestingly, in Galatians, he talks about going and meeting with Peter, whom biblical scholars assume to have been Simon Peter, the first pope. And yet, Paul doesn't record anything that Peter told him about Jesus. You would think that there would be a mad rush to record everything that those apostles remembered about what Jesus said and did, what he was like when the crowds weren't around, all of the things that he told them. But none of that stuff ever got recorded. Paul shows absolutely no interest in that. Paul could not care less about what Jesus said or did on earth, which is extremely suspicious.
So it's a wonderful observation that Paul doesn't seem to have recorded anything at all about the mortal life or ministry of the historical Jesus. But to call that suspicious is to betray a marked misunderstanding of what Paul was writing and why. Because when we look at Paul's writings, at least what has been preserved, and certainly there could be a lot that has not been preserved, but what has been preserved is all of the same basic genre. These are all paraenetic texts. These are all letters that are intended to guide and instruct and give counsel and basically manage affairs in the congregations that Paul has set up around the northern Mediterranean. We don't have biography. We don't have history. We don't have poetry. We don't have all these other genres from Paul. And when we look in that one genre that we have from Paul, we see a marked concern for being ready for the imminent second coming and basically the end of the world. And Paul even says, a rule I set down in all my congregations is that you stay in the life circumstances you were in when you were called by God, because the time is short. If you have a job, don't leave that job. If you don't have a family, don't start a family. If you are enslaved, unless you can manage to get out of it, just stay enslaved. Paul is telling people, Jesus is coming back too quickly for us to worry about big life changes. So his concern is not recording stuff for posterity. His concern is not literary in nature. It's paraenetic, which means it's counseling, it's guiding, it's giving advice, it's managing affairs. So Paul is using the resources he has for writing to manage affairs in the hopes that any day now Jesus would come back. So it's not suspicious that he never took the time to write down a history of the life of Jesus. It makes perfect sense in light of why he wrote what he did write. But there's more. When we look at Galatians, and he talks about visiting Jerusalem and seeing Peter for 15 days and seeing James as well, he's talking about 3 years after his road to Damascus event. And then he says, and 14 years after that, I went back to Jerusalem and talked to a bunch of folks, including Peter. So Galatians is not the text where he is reporting on his visit to Peter. Galatians is, again, a paraenetic, managing affairs letter that is mentioning stuff that happened well over a decade before the writing of that letter. So we shouldn't really expect Paul to have said anything about pumping Peter for information about Jesus' ministry in this letter, because that's not the genre, but it's also coming at least 14 years after his visit to Peter. And so if he did pump Peter for information about the historical Jesus, he could have very well shared that in person as he was setting up these congregations. He could have written that down somewhere else that was not preserved. But based on what has been preserved of Paul, we shouldn't really expect that to be the case, because all that Paul is preserving is these letters that are managing affairs in these different congregations. And that's not conducive to the original sharing of historical narratives. That's not where that kind of thing goes on. That kind of thing usually goes on in the establishing of those congregations. So when we look at the actual contents of Paul's letters, when we look at the genre Paul was writing, when we look at how Paul represents his own worldview, it's not suspicious. It actually makes perfectly fine sense. It's not what we would like, but it makes sense of why Paul was writing what he did write that happens to have been preserved down to us.
It's at this point that biblical scholars and historians will stand up and say, nobody just makes stuff up. Nobody just invents a God and starts to believe in it.
I don't know any biblical scholars or historians who say that people don't just make up gods. People do, but when they make up gods, it tends to follow certain patterns, and it tends to occur in a certain way that doesn't really fit with what we have with the tradition of Jesus. A far more likely explanation when it comes to how the data got to be the way they are in regards to the tradition of Jesus is that these divine events and attributions and features accreted to the tradition of an actual historical figure.
But people have always done exactly that. Serapis is a fantastic example. Serapis was a combination of Osiris and Zeus that was literally invented by the Greeks who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great conquered it. They one day just said, here's a new god, everybody, and people said, okay, and they started worshiping it.
So some concerns with this representation of where Serapis came from. That's absolutely not what happened. Ptolemy the First Soter did not just say, boom, we got a new deity, this is Osiris and Zeus. Serapis, the name, comes from Osiris Apis, which is a hybrid deity with Osiris and then Apis, two deities that were associated with the underworld. And that hybrid deity had been worshipped in Memphis long before Alexander the Great came by. So all the Ptolemaic dynasty did was slap a name on this deity and then say, ooh, we don't like your animal-based imagery. We're going to overlay this pre-existing hybrid deity with iconography and features and things like that associated with a bunch of our other favorite deities, like Zeus and like other deities. So it's really just a rebranding of a hybrid deity that already existed. So this is not like what happened with Jesus. Now, some people will say, well, Jesus was just a rebranding or hybridization of a bunch of different deities. And that's just not supported by the data. I've covered that in numerous videos. All of your zeitgeisty claims about how everybody was born of a virgin on December 25th are just made up. None of that is accurate. All of it is just made up. Serapis is not a good analog to Jesus, not only because Serapis is just a Greco-Roman rebranding of an existing Egyptian deity, but also you have a ruler imposing this new deity on a population, which is entirely distinct from a bottom-up grassroots following. You can establish a cult and a deity if you rule the nation. It's a lot different to try to establish and spread the worship of a brand new deity you just made up when it's women and enslaved people who are running this grassroots movement. So these are not analogous deities, and this is not a good argument. This is a conclusion in search of an argument. This is a dogma that is trying to find a rationalization and is having to misrepresent what goes on in the ancient world with the developments of divine profiles and worshipers and followings.
That's what people have always done. How do you think the Heaven's Gate cult thing happened? People just made up the stories and then other people believed in them. It's not that complicated.
Heaven's Gate was started by two Christians who decided that they were the two witnesses from the book of Revelation. And then they incorporated features of a UFO cult. And so it was really just taking a pre-existing tradition and slapping some new agey iconography and features and things like that onto it. And then from there, they accreted other new details to their narrative of how the end of the world is going to happen. That is also not analogous to what we have with the rise of followers of Jesus. But again, even if we do relate the accretion of these divine features to Jesus to the way that other divine figures have come about, that is the posthumous Christ tradition that we're talking about. It has no relationship to the historical Jesus that we reconstruct based on the available data. Even if we do acknowledge that the way that Jesus became divine and became worshipped as a god is analogous to the way other individuals have become divinized and worshipped as gods, and there are many ways that that is true, that doesn't bear on whether or not that tradition developed from a historical Jesus who was not divine and who was executed by the Romans because he caused a riot in the temple on Passover. So we have to keep these things separate. And there are almost no scholars of relevant disciplines who would say the best explanation for how the tradition got to be the way that it is in the data that are preserved down to us is that somebody just made it all up. That is not a good way to account for how the data got to be the way they are. It's certainly not the most likely explanation.
At this point, fundamentalists will usually say something like, Jesus is more well attested than Socrates, but this is also not true.
Yeah, that's a nonsensical argument, and I have long criticized the misinformation that is spread by folks who want to try to appeal to the thousands and thousands of manuscripts that overwhelmingly come from almost 1,000 years after the composition of the text of the New Testament. I'm going to skip over this because it's irrelevant.
And Socrates is actually unusually well documented for somebody from his era that never wrote a book and never conquered a country.
So I do want to dip back in here to note that this content creator can acknowledge the differences in the strength of attestation for different figures based on time and place, which means you should be able to acknowledge that we have virtually no attestation for almost everyone who lived in 1st century CE Judea and Galilee, irrespective of what they managed to achieve in their lives. There's not a lot of historical attestation for this time and place. It's really Josephus, some Philo, some other scattered references that document the history of this time and place. So the fact that someone who never wrote anything, probably had a small following, caused a riot in the temple over Passover and then was executed for his troubles, the fact that we don't have any first-hand historical accounts of that figure is no surprise whatsoever. Now, the fact that in the decades and centuries following his death, a huge following accreted to that tradition and he developed divine characteristics and became worshipped as the very God of the universe doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not that historical figure existed. That is an entirely separate consideration.
Personally, I would expect somebody who was as supposedly famous as Jesus was to be much more well documented.
But what if he was not as famous and as divine as the gospel accounts that were written decades after his death imagined he was? What if he was just an itinerant apocalyptic Jewish preacher who caused a riot in the temple over Passover and was crucified for his troubles? We're still presupposing that the gospel accounts are what we should find in the historical record. And that's just not the case. And so when we impose all of these demands on the Christ of the Gospels and say we don't find that in the historical record, we're not looking for the historical Jesus. We're looking for the Christ of the Gospels. Let's look for the historical Jesus.
I mean, Paul was operating within the Christian church only a few years after Jesus supposedly died, and yet he never recorded anything about the man that anybody told him, even though he supposedly knew the apostles that worked closely with Jesus during his lifetime. That just doesn't add up.
Well, it adds up just fine if you allow Paul to operate on his own terms and to be this apocalyptic philosopher preacher who is managing affairs in the congregations that he has set up around the northern Mediterranean in anticipation of the imminent second coming of Jesus. If we demand that he have this archivist intuition and instinct that so many of us have today, then it doesn't make much sense. But that's not who Paul was. That's not his history. If we allow him to operate on his own terms, it makes perfect sense. But that requires that we gain quite a bit of understanding of what's going on in the letters of Paul and what's going on with Paul and his life and the congregations that he has set up. That requires a lot of discipline, a lot of critical thinking. And the fit for this video has been Wolverine.